The Protection Fleet was a purposeful extension and overhaul of the Tau Empire's merchant fleet. As the Tau Empire expanded, the increasing scope and scale of threats to the greater good demanded that dedicated warships be created, lest the Tau be overwhelmed and their noble conquests throttled by selfish aliens. And with their most advanced technology at your disposal, you will dispose of any enemy that threaten the Tau Va. Hello there everyone. It is time to talk about the second of the two Tau Empire fleets, and that is going to be the Tau Protector Fleet. And right off the bat, these fleets are going to be almost very similar to that of the Tau Merchant Fleet, as opposed to all the other factions we've gone over so far, where there are very different type of playstyles to them. Hell, Adeptus Mechanicus and the Imperial Navy are the most obvious ones, and there are still some subtle differences under the hood with the Tau Protector Fleet. The big ones that you're going to have to make note of is the fact that all the ships are able to utilize their full firepower at will, as opposed to most of the Tau merchant fleets, which have a good assortment of broadside weaponry, as well as prow type weaponry to kind of engage the opponents. In the case of these ships, they are completely unhindered in that regard, and in fact, almost all their weaponry are also turret type of weaponry. While they may not have the 270-degree arc to fire unhindered even if you're trying to evade your opponent, it does give you a lot more flexibility to at least engage depending on the mobility and positioning of your fleet. Second of all, every single one of at least the Tau ships have access to the adaptive deflector, whereas the merchant fleet, only the hero had access to this, and it definitely is one of the more potent type of ships in the merchant fleet, where I didn't really talk too much about it, but it does have quite fearsome firepower as kind of a prelude to what the Protector Fleet was going to become. But all the other ships in the Merchant Fleet kind of are a little more limited and a lot more restricted in that regard at least. And of course, the most obvious one, as we're looking at the fleets page here, they also have access to all the auxiliary ships. They have the Crude War Spear and the Demiurge to help augment any type of playstyle you wish to go for. Hell, it gives you that convenience to play with a drastically different type of fleet while keeping your ranking with your Protector Fleet or even Merchant Fleet if you've been playing that fleet, without having to start brand new, I suppose would be the proper way to phrase it. But there's more than that. While they do trade off a little bit their durability and hit points for the convenience of the adaptive deflector on everything, they still have much more higher turning speed, which is a very subtle thing to note, as we talk about as already the fact that all their weaponry can be fired with their prow facing the opponent. And this is also good for evasive maneuvers, for the Tau Protector ships are also incredibly wide ships, which is a unique kind of a characteristic of this fleet in particular. Almost all the other factions we talked about so far have been incredibly narrow with a little bit of width or girth to them, but they aren't really susceptible enough to at least take torpedoes as seriously, at least if you're being engaged from the prow. But in the case of the Protector Fleet, the best way to hit these ships with torpedoes is to kind of engage them from the front. And that's something you're going to have to keep in mind. With the combination of the high energy turn and just a standard all head full, you will need to use these to good effect once you get into the thick of the fight to dodge those projectiles, since those are more than often what's going to kill you the most with the Tau Protector Fleet. They also have the benefit of being at least superior in the boarding front. Hell, they're even better, arguably, to that of the Imperial Navy because they have a 30% chance as opposed to a 10% chance of getting a critical assault action, which allows you the possibility to kill off cruisers or even light cruisers at a pretty reasonable rate. But with your lack of a lightning strike ability on all your ships outside of the auxiliaries, you're going to have a difficult time getting boarding in a lot of circumstances, so keep that in mind. Otherwise, even the light cruisers have the possibility to be equipped with seeker missiles and the fighter bays, although they are incredibly pricey, mainly due to the fact that they have gravitic hooks attached to them as well. But if you're planning on fielding frigates anyway, and you're not planning on taking a Custodian, which also have gravitic hooks, much like that of the Explorer of the Tau Merchant Fleet, then both these emissaries basically are going to be brought down to almost the same kind of point cost of that as the Sauce. So it's not as terrible as it may seem, but otherwise they would be some of the most expensive light cruisers in the game, just because of those frigates you're taking with you. And the Custodian itself, while an incredibly expensive ship, As a reminder, it does have 3 gravity hooks, so it does inflate the points quite a bit. For technically, it would actually be the same kind of cost as 2 protectors once you factor out what you're bringing in with the wardens themselves. While its firepower in the railguns is going to be slightly neutered a tiny bit, the Manta Bombers itself that it brings to bear cannot be underestimated, depending on how you utilize the Custodian. Never mind the fact that it also has the unique trait of increasing the effectiveness of all your point defense, which just straight up increases their accuracy. It's a flat 5% accuracy, which may not seem all that exciting, but since it's kind of a flat increase, and it should stack relatively well with your brace for impact stance, you will have incredible resilience against torpedoes and fighters for drawn out type of fights, so this should not be underestimated in any way. And with the extended range to the boarding assault actions, allowing you the 9,000 range to board a ship at distance, there can be some interesting synergies here, especially with what I hinted at already. You do have the possibility to at least kill off the crew of at least smaller type of ships, or at least fleets that have weaker crew complements, as opposed to a merchant fleet which can only realistically kill off crew 1 at a time, which is incredibly slow and not a very effective process. There is also another very unique trait to the Tau Protector Fleet in that all the Tau type ships will have access to Tau Warfares, which is the Monk Ka and the Cao Yang type of effects which you choose as you deploy your fleet in a battle. These primarily are only going to affect your railguns, so you really need to think on how you're going to utilize these, but they offer you some very unique benefits that at least you have the convenience to see what the map layout is going to be. For Cao Yang relies heavily on the amount of gas clouds and asteroid belts for you to utilize, where Monk Ka just relies your frigates to be able to use scanner pulses on the targets that you're engaging with to at least increase the chance of getting critical hits. And while the railguns may be very pitiful, very weak in comparison to all the other weaponry in the game, they do have a high rate of fire and they have a ridiculous amount of shots to them for each salvo you're firing. In the case of the Tau Protector Fleet, it's more about quantity as opposed to quality. And with ways to increase the accuracy of your ships as well, the Tau Protector Fleet is a very effective fleet to use in long-range type of engagements. This is also perhaps one of the main weaknesses of the Tau Protector Fleet as well. If you were going to try and utilize your warfare and your railguns, since your weaponry is all focused on the prow, you don't quite have the convenience to keep your distance and run away from your opponents in, say, situations like the Chaos fleets or even the Eldari that are utilizing the 270-degree arc with their star cannons. So any engagements that you do have, even at long range, is going to be rapidly short-lived unless you spread out your fleet in multiple segments. And this, I feel like, is key to getting the most out of your fleets. While you do have the adaptive deflector to incredibly mitigate a lot of this damage, once you get in close range with your opponents and start taking torpedo fire, your ships are rapidly going to fall apart, especially if you happen to be face off against a fleet that is reliant or at least encouraged to do heavy ramming against you. And with your lower amount of hit points and the fact that your adaptive deflectors are tied to your generators, you could start falling apart and crumbling incredibly quickly. So softening up your opponent range and doing light engagements early on can be important to at least cripple and start separating the fleet piecemeal. For if you can get engine destructions early on for something that's really mobile, they're generally not going to be contributing to the rest of the fight there unless you're trying to kill off. And if you happen to be face off against something that's incredibly mobile, this is where your prow, your heavy reliance on your prow is really damn important, for you can have the easiest time to just chase that elusive Eldari threat or even hunt down a Chaos fleet. For you are completely unhindered as you chase them, and all your weaponry is going to be firing upon them. And it's for that reason that perhaps the Tau Protector Fleet may be the most fearsome long-range fleet in the game, at least when paired off against the other factions that are encouraged that play that way. For you have the ridiculously high turning speed to arguably dodge the Novacans of the Adeptus Mechanicus incredibly well. Chaos can be hunted down at a constant rate without any sacrifice to your firepower. And any Eldari that are utilizing heavy amounts of Void Stalkers or at least longer range type of fleets will have a difficult time and likely get cornered if you are really good about spotting them or at least forcing them in a certain direction. And this does not mean you are helpless against the closer range factions as well, for like I hinted at already, your high turning radius allows you to do some really interesting maneuvers to kind of outposition your opponent's such close range engagements, especially in some subtle cases like maybe Necrons and Orcs, and even to a limited extent the Tyranids as well. If they try and recklessly charge towards you, and an engagement is inevitable, you can easily fly right behind their fleet, and due to the fact they have no high energy turn, or possibly already burnt their mobility, then you can get a window of like 30-40 seconds where you could just fire at them almost for free and avoid the majority of their firepower, if not just prime yourself up for a bomber and secret missile barrage on something that can't dodge. And even the secret missiles and bombers alone will get you a victory in a lot of circumstances in those type of matchups anyway, if not heavily cripple your opponent right off the bat. And with the sheer amount of fighter squadrons you have at your disposal too, it is really damn simple to make good use of these secret missiles, or at least allowing them to actually hit their target. Although your opponent is very likely to be able to mitigate this really damn well by either using their prow, or using gas clouds, or even other little tricks to kind of trick your fighters to be out of range of the point defenses, so you do need to keep that in mind if you're going to go with the reckless brute force type of route with your bombers and your secret missiles. So you should not expect this to always be effective if you open up with your secret missiles. Where the secret missiles are probably strongest is, like I said before, already hinted at a moment ago, just flying out into an awkward angle where they can't reliably engage you, and then just fire secret missiles at their most vulnerable portion of the ship. And even if they try and disengage away, then you have the convenience to just give yourself some more breathing room and more time to just fire on the ship. It is still going to be a slow process, especially against anything that has 83 armor like that, the Space Marines and the Necrons, but with some abilities like the experimental railguns to help along with this matter, and Stasis Bomb to keep your distance, especially in the case of Space Marines, you can at least get to the point where they're crippled enough to have easy access to your secret missiles doing the killing blow necessary. But if they don't hit the targets that you want, due to their extra mobility in the case of the inertialess drive and the Space Marines in general, then you are going to have to deal with ships that have half their health still intact. And it is, like I said, a very awkward situation for your railguns, since honestly, the railguns of the Tau Protector Fleet and even some of the Merchant Fleet only do 4 damage a shot. And ultimately what this means, when you're faced off against 83 armor, you are actually doing less than a single point of damage. Don't get me wrong, you still have like 60, 70, even more railgun shots depending on what you're utilizing. So this is not as terrible as it may seem, as opposed to maybe like the 8 shots of a single Imperial Navy cruiser. And the railguns are also some of the faster firing weapons in the game as well, which is a lot of the reason why their damage is so low in comparison's sake. So it does rely heavily on you to fire these for long periods of time for their damage to start adding up. Which goes into a little bit about the fleets I've been trying to utilize for my time with the Tau Protector Fleet, and I did use a handful of different fleets. A lot of it was to experiment with the Cao Yang fleet, or the Cao Yang style of play, but the main one that I think has promise in some regards, but is definitely more complicated, is going to be the use of my Custodian, 2 Protectors, and 3 Sauce Emissary light cruisers, as well as having the 3 warrants that come included with the Custodian. A lot of the times I've been using my Custodian to serve as a kind of bait, for it's the one kind of ship that is best equipped to run away and still do a ridiculous amount of damage to your opponents, with the simple matter that there's 6 fighter squadrons on the Custodian, so even if you were to launch Manta Bombers on your opponent, the sheer amount of hit points that these squadrons have when all combined together means you're almost always going to do full damage with the Manta Bombers in a lot of circumstances, especially if your opponent is just charging towards you. Although if they have fighter squadrons, this is easily neutered quite heavily, but with the additional point defense and your sheer amount of fighter squadrons for defensive purposes, or at least dealing with their point defense, that can heavily be alleviated with the combination of the Protectors to serve as the bombers and firing secret missiles. Although the secret missiles a lot of the times is how you're going to be winning a lot of your battles, and with the lack of fighters overall, especially with your Sauces being restricted, only having 2 charges of their secret missiles, while also having 2 protectors with very limited amount of fighters and secret missiles to kind of bomb down a target, you are kind of relegated to the custodian pulling a lot of the weight there in terms of distracting a point defense, trying to do the damage to be threatening enough, and of course serve as bait, which can be a bit of a problem. For your Sauces don't actually have additional speed like most of the other light cruisers have in comparison, so they can get hunted down by a tenacious opponent if you position them poorly, but this is where I like having the ships kind of engage the flank, not necessarily with the protectors, because you never know when your opponent may try and turn to chase down a fleet of 5 ships there, which make up like almost 2/3 of your fleet cost. And if you death ball with your fleet too much and you rely on the railguns to do damage over time, you are going to be doing no damage at all if you're going to be spending most of the time running away from your opponents. However, it does also result in a lot of split fire as well, but the idea is to start crippling components and start isolating ships more so than actually killing them. So that way when you do eventually go in for the killing blow, you may have to only deal with a single ship or 2 that's actually a threat to you, whereas the other ones are never going to catch up to you just because of the reduced speed and lack of mobility. So that is a much more realistic prospect. You just may have very little room to maneuver due to the fact that you've been kiting all game up to this point. And my second fleet that I've been utilizing a bit, that's the most simplistic of the Tau Protector fleet, and can very easily be translated over to a Tau Merchant fleet type of style if you so wish, will be the 6 Cruiser, the 6 Protector type of fleet. And the reason I say this can easily be translated over to the Tau Merchant fleet is because the Protectors are very damn similar to that of the Hero. They just cost a little bit more points, and as the trade-off is the less crew complement and weaker boarding for the additional hit points on the ships themselves. And you are going to have a lot of success with this fleet just because of the simplicity of it, the fact that your squadrons normally will be in 2 separate fleets, and the amount of secret missiles and fighters that can so easily complement each other. There's a lot of situations where your opponent can't really deal with the secret missiles at all, as far as avoiding the damage at least. They are still going to take the hits, it's just up to your opponents based on how effective they can mitigate said damage, or at least make good use of gas clouds and asteroid belts to maybe conceal the ships and deny you at least 1 charge of your missiles. And the Protectors still have an incredible amount of railguns dedicated to them, especially if you can keep the prow on them, for their fixed heavy railguns are a lot more potent than all the other railguns up to this point. They just don't have the convenience of like kiting maneuvers like that of the Sauce and Custodian due to they have less potent turret weaponry as a result. But if you can keep them in the engagement, then they are doing a lot more damage in comparison. And with the sheer amount of bombers you have available to you, once you do sit out the amount of cruisers you have to engage, your bombers rapidly become so much more potent, especially if you can have a single fighter squadron still available to kind of protect them. For if they ever return to your Protectors over time, you are just refunding the charges, and this allows you to overwhelm an opponent, even if you are not relying solely on the railguns to do damage. It is effective, it is simple, and it's pretty damn resilient, especially with the amount of boarding assaults you have available to you as well. You can very realistically kill off the crew of a ship or 2 if you position yourself properly and are willing to get your hands dirty in the thick of it. The only problem to note with the Tau fleets in general is because the secret missiles don't have a hotkey associated to them, it's really dangerous to use these secret missiles in point blank range, especially in combination with how wide your ships are in general. If you don't fire the secret missiles in a way that they're guaranteed to hit, if they ever miss in this type of close range engagement, you are far more likely to hit yourself than actually the opponent. So you should almost always use up the secret missiles at a distance for your own safety. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the skills and upgrades for the Protector fleet, and they are the exact carbon copies of what the Tau Merchant fleet have access to, although how you will utilize them may be a little bit different. The experimental railgun shot, it goes without saying, even though it technically says 100 damage ignores shields and armor. In game, it really does 300 points of damage, and this is a great way to complement your secret missiles and harassment at range, if not just softening up a target and prime it for maybe a kill later on. Especially if you're going up against like a battleship heavy type of fleet where it's a lot more difficult to cripple their engines and start isolating them. Stasis Bomb, without a doubt, allows you to disengage a lot more effectively, and it allows you to play the longer range type of game. Although, due to the difficulty of hitting this on something that's kind of kiting you or at least engaging at a distance as well, this is only really practical against something that wants to get in your face, like the Imperial Navy, like the Space Marines, and even Necrons to a limited extent. So you will have no value with this against Eldari in a lot of circumstances, or even the Chaos fleets. Disruption Bomb can be really damn impactful, but it is heavily restricted by the range of the bomb. So realistically, you're not going to get to use this to open up with your railguns in any form at all. It's only going to be used either for dealing with Eldaris or to just reset the charge on the enemy shields after you've already taken them down. But once the shields are down for longer periods of time and you're making good use of your scanner pulse with the Monka warfare, you will at least get more time to at least get those critical hits you want. The repair drones, without a doubt, is something you want to use for drawn out type of fights. It can be impactful for short-term type of battles as well, for a single charge can almost mitigate the loss in health that you have compared to all the other fleets in the game. But without a doubt, the longer the fight drags out, the more value you're getting out of this thing. So it's best used for something that doesn't want to get in your face and has the potential to kill off your fleet immediately. Supercharged Void Shield can be really damn good, especially if you're utilizing a Custodian. The convenience of recharging your shields and just making them immune to something that's burst heavy will give you a lot of longevity to the ship. It does require it to be constantly taking the fire to really get the most out of this, and with the high shields of your ships and the width of them, you can easily just cycle your ships around if you are worried about disruption overcharge kind of pausing your shield regeneration. And while the upgrades are a little more specific and ones that you want to consistently keep utilizing, there are some niche cases that can be very impactful for your fleets. The experimental thruster manifold is really damn important for just the convenience of mobility's sake. Since even all this time I talked about how you want to fight at longer range, especially with just the secret missiles in general, due to the convenience of protecting yourself, you are still just as slow as the Imperial Navy fleet, coupled with the fact that you want to have your prow facing your opponent to maximize your damage potential. So every little bit of speed and rotation speed you can get helps tremendously in that factor. A mission dissipator, this is important to note, it affects every ship in your fleet, and while your cruisers and battleships don't have the convenience of reconcealing themselves at will like that of the Chaos fleet in their Winds of Change, you can still mitigate taking shots if you position yourself properly, for Tau do rely heavily on good positioning to at least get the most out of their firepower and of course their skills in general. And it goes without saying, if you can position yourself near an asteroid belt or a gas cloud, you can easily run away with all ahead full active and just immediately conceal your ships, especially if they're taking heavy damage or their shields are down and you're fearing like a heavy critical hit shot from maybe something like a bombardment cannon or pulsar shots. Strobe field can be impactful, but I feel like this is unnecessary at long range. In truth, this will have use for you if you are in the thick of it at close range, since it cuts down the accuracy in half. So if your opponent is in like armor piercing range with an 80% chance to hit, this will cut it down to 40% for you, and it gives you the opportunity to kind of encourage you to out-position your opponent by getting behind them, or just force them to burn a lot of their combustion gauge and leave them vulnerable to your secret missile and bomber barrage. And as a result, it gives you more durability in those cases. However, to truly get the most out of this strobe field, you really do need to be aware of the timing of when the macro cannons fire. For if you just leave your combustion gauge running just out of habit, you are not really going to get much use out of this. You're only going to be dodging one shot at a time mostly. especially if you are trying to avoid getting their fire arcs. Targeting Coordinator, while I may be incredibly biased towards this upgrade, there is still some really valid use for this type of weapon, especially in the cases of Protector Fleet, or even if you're going with a hero heavy type of fleet with the merchants. However, it does require you to have a frigate in the lock-on stance to get use of this, but it increases your accuracy to that of the Eldari. And what this will look on paper is if your ships are not using the lock-on stance themselves, you basically get a free additional plus 20 to your accuracy at 18,000 range. And if you were to ever lock on top of that, you have a 60% chance of just hitting your target at maximum distance, which allows you to get a lot of reliable hits in and a lot of damage over time, especially if comboed with the Monka for the additional critical hit chance. It can be pretty impactful damage over time if utilized properly. Watercast Diplomat, I didn't talk a whole lot about the auxiliary ships, and while this was nerfed since my video on the Tau Merchant Fleet, this is still a really damn important upgrade for when you are utilizing the War Spears or Demiurge, and hell, even the Nikasars benefit off this as well. You need to keep in mind that the Demiurge will have a plus 15 bravery as a result of this, and the Crew War Spears are going to be brought down to minus 10 bravery. So while they can still mutiny, they will heavily mitigate a lot of the morale damage they might take over time. Now that goes over everything that you pretty much need to know with the Tau Protector Fleet. And while early on you may have better success with the Tau Merchant Fleet just because of their heavier reliance on fighters and seeker missiles, on top of the cheaper point cost of their ships as well, the Tau Protector Fleet has a lot of potential to offer with their higher mobility and the warfares to kind of augment the power of your railguns. While they may not really help your seeker missiles and bombers all that much, the fact that you have additional boarding damage available to you, the better convenience to get critical hits and cripple your opponents, never mind the subtle nuance of the higher rotation speed mixed with the experimental thruster manifold, allow you to do some really neat maneuvers to kind of outposition your opponent even in close range a lot of times. So they are without a doubt a lot more difficult and a little bit more fragile with their lower hit point pool. But with auxiliary ships to help augment any type of gaps in your fleet strategy, or just to completely mix up your fleet, you are sure to have a fun time with them regardless. So I thank you all for watching, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you on the battlefield.